Yeah, so now you know who we are. I'm Kate, that's Gabrielle. We're going to talk about this. And to talk about that, we're going to cover a bit of context. We're going to talk about what we've done, what users think of what we've done, and ultimately what that means for government, which is the exciting bit, I think. So we are from the Gov.uk programme. Hopefully all of you know that Gov.uk is the single website for all of the UK government. It was launched back in 2012. And the work we've both been doing over the last, year more, has focused on answering this question. How does Gov.uk help government to deliver joined-up end-to-end services? And doing this is really important because most of government spends most of its time designing, redesigning, building and running services. Most of the people who work in government are involved, like directly or indirectly, in delivering these services. But helping government do this is really freaking hard for many reasons, and Gabrielle's going to talk a bit about what those are.
Okay, so firstly, government is really old. So the men in this photo actually wrote the report that led to the creation of the civil service. And this was back in 1854, which is a massive 165 years ago now. So fast forward to today, obviously we look a bit different now. Civil servants have fewer extravagant sideburns and there's a lot more trainers in our office. But a lot of the principles from that original report still actually influence how we work today. So a lot of the context, the principles and the structure of government are really old. And as a result, so are a lot of the services that we operate as well, from the legislation that shapes them to the technology that they're built on as well. And secondly, government is very big as well. So across the 25 ministerial departments, there's about 400,000 people. That figure looks very kind of specific, but I don't know if it's probably not that exact.
It's increased a bit in the last few months.
Yeah. So it's huge. Oh, that looks different to how it... Okay, this slide looks weird, but basically what this was illustrating is that one of the big challenges is in government is because it's so big, it's set up in all these different silos.
These are supposed to be departments.
Yeah, different departments.
HMRC, DWP, Home Office.
And so each department is run as a separate entity. And this might make things a little bit simpler for government to chop things up in this way, but it doesn't make any sense for users. Because if you want to do something with government, you shouldn't have to know which part of government you need to interact with. And quite often as well, you'll need to interact with more than one part of government, but it's really hard to know that if you don't have that in-depth knowledge of how government works. So another slide that doesn't look exactly as it should, but you get the scream emoji, which is the most important part. So this was actually showing that within a department, there's silos as well. So quite often you'll get lots of different teams that don't speak to one another, or they'll speak about things in a completely different way to one another. And in terms of content, some departments don't have a content team, they might have a comms team instead, or they might just have one content person working on their own. And so all of these people that work across different teams in different silos in a department are all in charge of little bits and pieces of services which are created in isolation of each other and without having a proper look and understanding of the context of how each of their things fit into a wider user's journey. So this is generally how government often sees services. So this form here is how to appeal an independent tribunal. So, for example, you might have to do this if you're a driving instructor and you've had your license taken away from you. So this comes as a Word document, and it also comes with a 7-page document of guidance to help you fill in the form, which is obviously not ideal. And this form can be used for multiple purposes as well, none of which are immediately clear just by looking at the form. And so this is the Statutory Off-Road Vehicle Notification, otherwise known as SORN. So how many people have heard of SORN before? Yes, quite a few people, which is, the acronym is so entrenched now that it's actually used generally as a verb, which is awful. We hate it. So people say things like, I'm going to SORN my car, which is, it's just awful. One day we'll get rid of this. And
we'll kill it. It's my long-term ambition.
Yeah, one day. In plain English, this is actually how you tell government that you're taking your car off the road. But obviously users don't see services like this. They see them in the context of things that they want to do. For example, I want to learn to drive a car, or I want to buy a house. To a user, services are simple. It's a verb, it's something that you're trying to do. It's not a noun that the government has created in order to categorise something. But gov.uk is still full of nouns, which are published by different parts of government, and these all make up the different bits and pieces of very fragmented end-to-end services. So we estimate there's about 500,000 pages on gov.uk. I think we came up with this figure a few months ago, so it's probably significantly larger now. But as you can imagine, when you've got that much content, trying to navigate through that and try and find what you need and the order in which you need to do those things is extremely difficult. And we know that when services aren't simple, users just phone up because they can't find the answer they want online. Or even worse, they can jump straight into transactions that are completely inappropriate for them and they're likely to fail. So the Drivers and Vehicles Licensing Authority, just that department spends £19 million a year answering questions about how do I do this thing over the phone, and this makes up 2/3 of all of their departmental contact.
So that's where we come in, that's where gov.uk comes in, and the work that we've been doing on what we call step-by-step navigation. Every week, millions of people are using gov.uk to do really complex and sometimes quite life-changing tasks, and there's often lots to find, lots for them to read, lots of transactions to complete, and they need to do all of these things in the right time and in the right order. So Step-by-Step is designed to help solve these kinds of problems for government. By guiding users through these complex tasks, it's making it clear to them where they are in an overall process, orienting them back to previous steps before they go off and do the wrong thing or before they pick up the phone. It's shaped around user needs, bringing fragmented content and transactions together in clear steps and making it much easier for people to see what they need to do. So this is Learning to Drive. This is the first one that we published, I think, over a year ago now. And in its first 6 months, it was used over 1 million times. The step-by-step consists of an overview page where it provides users with all those content and transactions they need to complete each task and each step in the process. It helps them navigate through these tasks in the right time, in the right order. It also shows users where costs are involved and also where there are different routes through the process depending on their situation. And the navigation also sits on each page a user might land on within that journey. So here it shows them where they are in that process, and it gives them a route to what they should have done beforehand and what they should do next. And this is really important because we know that for most people, their journeys on gov.uk start directly on guidance, and usually they start on a page that they found through guesswork based on their vague understanding of how that process might work. So we need to orient them within that journey and help them figure out, have they jumped in too far through that journey? Do they need to go back and check their eligibility or do other things that they should have done? So in order for us to kind of really land the concept of step-by-step within government and get traction on it, we had to tackle two main things in order to get buy-in. Government is full of people who are working on things that they think are entirely special snowflakes, and they're sort of determined that their thing won't fit a pattern that's being developed. So we really needed to show that this pattern would accommodate services of all shapes and sizes, such as, for example, services that aren't perfectly linear, and that it needed to accommodate users with different needs and different circumstances who might be taking different routes through that service, completing different steps and tasks depending on their situation. So just even with the sort of driving, within the driving realm, these are step-by-steps that we've already published. They're quite a variety just here. Becoming a driving instructor, that's a really long process. It's about 9 steps. It's very complicated. There's quite a lot of guidance within that. Learning to drive, that's quite a widely understood process. Most people have a concept of where to begin with that. Buying a vehicle, that doesn't sound like a government service. I mean, it's not really. The main action that you're taking in buying a vehicle is entirely not to do with government, but there are things around that process that you need to complete with government, and but packaging it up in around the main task that you're completing is the way that makes sense to users. The interaction design of this is pretty simple. We've got the sort of numbered steps on a tube line, and we've got this and or element that indicates the ordering and options of steps. So for example, in learning to drive, you can see step 3, you've got preparing for your theory test and driving lessons and practice, because you can do these things at the same time simultaneously. But actually, in this pattern, the heavy lifting is really being done by content and content patterns. We're using words to, for example, capture the type of actions user needs to complete. So here you've got a checking step and an apply step. We're using content patterns to talk about the dependencies between each step. So you can't start this step before you've done the one before it. We're using content patterns to talk about routing, to make it clear what steps are relevant to a user and what steps aren't relevant to them, which ones they can skip. Like, this stuff is much easier to do with words, and it's much more accessible. We originally had a much more complicated tube line design, but in trying to communicate more with the sort of graphic layout, we ended up communicating less because it was confusing people, and because they were confused, they were coming up with their own meanings of what we were trying to communicate with that design. So instead we pared it right back and we started using words instead. Also, behind what users see in the front end, we've applied a structure to the words that we're using, which means that they're now more machine readable. Machines read them a bit like a recipe. So this means it's becoming the source of increasingly high quality answers in search engines and voice assistants. So if I can make this play.
Okay Google, how do I learn to drive a car?
Here's what I found on the web.
When can I start learning?
According to gov.uk, you can apply for a provisional driving license when you're 15 years and 9 months old. You can start driving a car when you're 17.
Okay, so obviously we know that Step-by-Step works quite well to navigate people, but the content it links to, what about that? So whenever we build a step-by-step, we start off by doing a big audit of all of the content that a user might come across when they're looking at that area. So we'll use search terms on looking at Google keywords, we'll look at internal search, we'll look at Google Analytics to get an idea of all the different URLs that people might be traveling through to, and we'll pull all of that content out, and then we'll start making a big map of how people might be using that and also going through the service. So for starters, when you start looking at all of the content and information in the context of the tasks that people want to do, it can really help you understand where the content isn't actually delivering the clarity and the information that users need. So you can start to spot where different departments or even teams within the same department are actually publishing content about the same thing but in a different way. We know from I think every single round of research that we've done on Step-by-Step that when there's lots of duplicate content, it makes it really hard for people to understand if they found the right thing. And we have seen cases where people have landed on the right piece of information, but because they've got sort of 10 tabs open for other similar looking pieces of content, they're really unsure that that is the right answer for them. So being able to map it out in this way helps us spot duplication, and that means we can then make changes to that content so users are confident that they found what they need. And it can also help departments make sure that the people in government who are talking about their service are using the same language to describe it and aligning that with how they communicate with their users, so they're all giving a consistent message about that content. So a bit about what users think as well. We did 8 rounds of user research to test the step-by-step design, and there were 3 things that came out consistently, which are presenting tasks as clear steps really helps users, seeing the whole process makes it seem manageable, and the design is easily understood and accessible. So there's a quote here from someone who was using the Learn to Drive step-by-step, which is, it does actually show you where you are. Having it next to what you're looking at is really helpful. So this person was talking about the step-by-step in the sidebar position, so this shows that it's helping them navigate and orient themselves when they're in a piece of content. Another one here from someone using one of the newer step-by-steps that we published last quarter, which is how to claim New Style Employment and Support Allowance. So this person said it's good because it gives you a lot of information. Usually you have to hunt around for it. And we saw that participants coming to that area were coming with problems where they just found so much content on that thing, and it was really hard to understand, even if they were on the benefit that they are actually eligible for, to understand if that is the thing they're eligible for, what type of benefit, because some of the benefits are sort of sectioned up, there's different types of ESA. So yeah, having the step-by-step there did help them to understand. And then this person was actually using the Get a Divorce step-by-step. Obviously divorce is a horribly complex, highly emotional, stressful process. So to have this person say this was a real achievement, but they said, yeah, it's like a train ride. It's quite easy, step 1, step 2. This makes it seem more like it's doable. In my head, it's like, okay, it's quite straightforward. It's not so difficult. And the participant who actually said this as well was going through divorce proceedings at that point in time, and she'd kind of hit a wall with it and was having real difficulty moving on to the next step. And she said that after this, she felt confident that she did know what the next thing was she needed to do. So that was really great. And we know as well that users are finding it useful. So every gov.uk page has this blue banner at the bottom of it where users can give feedback on whether this specific piece of content has been useful for them. They just click a simple yes or no. So based on this feedback, we know that step-by-step as a format is, this score for step-by-steps in general is well above the site average, which is 51%. So these are some of the most highly scoring step-by-steps. So become a driving instructor, 77% of the people that clicked that button said it was useful. And we also did some work to look at if there was any correlation between how complicated the step-by-steps were and the services around them and the usefulness score, and there was. So these are some of the most highly scoring ones, but they're also some of the most complicated processes that we've had to map, particularly become a driving instructor, which, yeah, I think Kate said earlier, it's something like 9 steps, there's loads of transactions, loads of guidance, there's really complex eligibility criteria as well. So generally, the more complicated the process, the more value that the step-by-step can provide. We also gave 2 groups of users a task to find information on gov.uk. One group had step-by-step and the other group didn't have access to it. This table did show the difference between task completion for those different groups of users, but I'll just tell you what it is. It was 10% more people were able to complete it with the step-by-step than without it, so that was really great. We also asked users about their confidence in finding information on gov.uk as well, and again we saw quite a big difference. This was around 11% difference, which is a good thing I've memorised it because it's not in the speaker's notes. I'm not just making it up. We also saw an overall increase in the number of users reporting that they found it easy to navigate gov.uk. I don't actually remember that one and it's not in the speaker's notes, but it was an increase.
I think it was also around 10%.
Yeah, we'll say 10%.
Oh. So we know there are like hundreds of these that we could build on gov.uk that would take people through almost every major life event, whether you're like registering the birth of a child or you're planning your retirement. But this isn't just about UX. This is about changing the way that government works so that they're collaborating across those departmental silos. And it's also about showing government what they should work on, where they can make improvements to not just the content, but beyond that, the policy and the processes that will really help users. So step-by-steps and building step-by-steps is really just the first part of the process for service improvement. Step 1 is just like organise everything and spot things that are missing. Step 2 is make sure that we're explaining the current process as clearly as we can. But then step 3, it's about recognising that content design can only get us so far, but it can certainly highlight where services need to change or where policy needs to change. No amount of good content design can explain a bad policy or a service that just literally doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So really, our goal is that government will be shaped by the user-focused services that it's providing, not the other way around. And if we can continue to do that, then hopefully building better services will in turn help us to build a better government. Thank you.